between himself and Carl. What's going on in this particular story is basically Carl's story, because Carl wants to meet someone, a Jew, to whom he can begin to express the experiences he has had, this SS officer, and more than that, to request from a Jew an understanding, or what Wiesenthal calls forgiveness. Carl is asking for absolution. So the story ensues. And again, as I need to point out, as in any memoir, the story that we begin to hear could well be Carl's story, but that's not the point here. This is Wiesenthal's story that at least he wants us to hear. So what he's selecting from, the story that Carl's telling him is an important point here, because Wiesenthal wants us to understand something about Carl, okay? So, Carl then tells him the story. On one occasion, he and other SS officers and military folks were asked to round up Jews in one small town in Poland after an incident took place in which Jews, of course, were blamed for it. Jews were rounded up in a house locally. In the house there, they proceeded to set on fire, to incinerate Jews within this house. Beyond that, there were those who were trying desperately to flee from the fire from within the house, were jumping out of windows, including children. Carl talks, therefore, about, or Wiesenthal tells us, that Carl refers to himself and others shooting at those who are jumping for their lives. This is the heart of the story. This is what Carl confesses, and Carl, on that basis, is asking a Jew to forgive him for those deeds. How the story unfolds, of course, is quite interesting, but how Wiesenthal tells us the story is also very interesting, because he begins by saying that Carl had all along been staring at Wiesenthal in trying to tell him this particular story. Interesting enough, I suppose, but the truth is, as Wiesenthal reports to us, this was an individual, recovering from his wounds. He had bandages covering almost entirely his face, including his eyes, so that it was really not possible, for him, Carl, to be staring at Wiesenthal. But Wiesenthal, to give you one example of this, nonetheless believed that he felt as if Carl was looking at him. That for Wiesenthal to report this detail to us is also saying that that was important for him, that he was making some kind of connection with Carl. A minor detail, but I think it tells us something important. Second example, that when Carl talks about shooting at these folks who were jumping for their lives from this home, according to Wiesenthal, Carl reported to Wiesenthal that he noticed particularly the eyes of one particular child. He locked into, the eyes of this child. Why does Wiesenthal tell us this? Probably because he felt as if Carl was establishing himself, something more than that brutal, relationship with Jews. There was something else going on, Wiesenthal believed, or wanted to believe, that Carl was trying to establish. In other words, that Wiesenthal is giving us some of this detail to help us understand that he, Wiesenthal, was forming a human connection with Carl, were he not to give us these details, we would have only the narrative, right, that bears witness to this brutal story. But there's more in this narrative, and Wiesenthal is deliberately giving us something more to begin to think about. And what affirms this particular, therefore, narrative, connotative narrative that's going on in this story was Wiesenthal's decision after the war to visit Karl's mother. He gets the address from a laundry bag, etc., and so forth, and uses that to begin to track down Karl's mother. Why? Why does he want to do this? As Wiesenthal tells us, he wanted to get a more complete picture of Karl's personality. That's Wiesenthal's term. A more complete picture. Certainly the picture of a dastardly, right, behavior during this period of Wiesenthal's life. But something else he was also trying to establish, which is perhaps stated most clearly when Wiesenthal writes, to understand someone, in his words, Wiesenthal's, who did not want to be a murderer, but who had been made into a murderer by a murderous ideology. And in that, I believe, we begin to see the complicated killer that Wiesenthal is giving us in this case. Not the killer that results from splitting, the black and white kind of image, but something more complicated. Yes, he was a murderer, but he insists, and by the way, he insists on this 3 times. He makes this statement 3 times in this memoir. He wants us to understand that Karl was a murderer, but he also said he was made into a murderer, which therefore suggests, right, that for Wiesenthal, Karl was somebody. He was something else. He was a human being. He did have a life. There was an existence prior to the offense, that the offender had a life before the offense, that the criminal, Karl, wasn't always a criminal. He was, in fact, a human being. And I believe Wiesenthal's struggling with this. This is not an easy, right, idea for any survivor. And indeed, if you look at the memoir, he does struggle with this. He does not grant Karl forgiveness. But he's telling us a rich story. And I think it illuminates part of the problem that we're referring to now. How does Jean-Améry do this? Again, recalling that Améry is regarded as the champion of resentment. He believes, he argues, that his experiences, largely from torture, during these years, left him a different human being, and indeed he was. And he wants the world to know that he was and is a different human being. And so, he is one that you can hardly miss the point, right, of someone trying to widen this gap between himself, Améry in this case, and his offenders, these torturers. It's a classic example of splitting, or what, right, Améry himself refers to as a moral chasm between himself and his offenders. And that he moreover valorizes what he calls his retroactive rancor. But interestingly, at least twice in this collection of reflections, he states that he wants to explicitly, his word, abandon his insistence on the moral chasm that he felt between himself and other Germans. Germans then, during the Nazi era, and Germans in his own time from the 1960s who he felt were indifferent to this Nazi past and who insisted on moving on and therefore he also condemns these folks as well. This term abandonment is an interesting one, and one that I want to borrow the idea, at least, from a literary critic, Harold Bloom, who refers to in literary text generally the desire of a writer to break free from an argument or thesis that he or she is establishing in their text. That is to say, when a writer commits himself or herself to an idea, sometimes they feel like they're trapped by the idea. This is a little bit of what Bloom is referring to here. And therefore begins to identify narratives in most literary texts in which the writer wants to break free from that, goes through a process of self-revision, or what Bloom refers to as poetic misprison, which I think is a great term. That's what I think Amory is going through in this case. He wants to abandon the weight, the gravity of this resentment that he dwells on. He wants to find a way to kind of break through without compromising the resentment he feels that he earned. That's not what he wants to do. And so we begin to find, again, adopting this kind of dual image, of the narrative, that both narratives are going on within his, understanding, his self-understanding. Which is to say, on the one hand, the retroactive rancor, that's important and you can't miss it. But the abandonment of that as well. Or as he writes, he allowed himself to dream that Germans would comprehend their acquiescence in crimes or their contemporary indifference about the crimes, to become, these are his words, noble, and to make possible a reality to live together as fellow human beings. This is not, by the way, at all the major text. This is subtext. But it is, after all, important subtext. He goes on to say, or express, a belief that his torturers were capable, his words, again, of undoing what had been done, and that history would become moral. I believe, therefore, even Amory is an example of what we're talking about here in trying to express, something other than the intentional narrative, and to begin to connote or suggest, a reaching out towards something else. That is to say, there is a tendency in these testimonies to narrow this gap between victim and offender, to explore the pre-traumatic reality of their lives, and therefore, though it's a subtext, it's really a counter-narrative. There's narrative and counter-narrative. There's tension, in other words, in these testimonies, and that tension is a struggle for survivors who explore it. We call this, or Langer calls this, deep memory, but the survivor, Charlotte Delvaux, also refers to this as sense memory. Thinking memory, she writes, that's to say, the common memory, and sense memory, something she knows also exists, this deeper level of memory. Survivors see the offender or want to see the offender beyond and as well as incriminated in the offense. And as a result, they reverse this tendency to split and achieve this connection. And so one more point I'd like to make before we open this up to your comments or questions. I've been using the word connection to characterize this counter-narrative in the testimonies. But the term sounds a little like forgiveness.